Sure. People often refer to me as an artist, and actually I resist that notion. And partly the reason I resist it is because I don't think of myself as an artist, I think of myself as an educator. And I think the difference is that artists sometimes think about the audience, but they're mostly thinking about their own statement that they want to make. And the audience isn't so central to it. Whereas for me, whatever I do, unless there's an effect, unless people move in the kind of direction I want them to move, I don't think it's very effective. And I think, so in that sense, for me, think of myself as a film artist, however, has never been quite my identity. And I think of myself much more as an educator, because I'm much more concerned with how what I'm producing affects the audience that's listening to it. And that's really that's a really pedagogical approach to things as opposed to an artistic approach. I'm not saying artistic stuff is necessarily wrong, but I think it just has a different perspective. That art is more about, okay, here is my statement I want to make, whereas pedagogy is really about, okay, what's the interaction between what you want to do and where the audience is, so that the audience can move in some direction. I think if you want to engage with the social world, you have to use the language of the social world. And I think there's a lot of academics who kind of, decry the decline of literacy and the decline of the written word, etc. And I guess you could do that. But for me, if you're really engaged with the social world, it doesn't really matter the language, or it really doesn't matter the form. It really matters if you can engage with that world. And I think if you want to engage with young people, you have to meet them where they are, or you have to use that language. And that language in these days is the language of the visual and the language of film. And so for one, the reason I use film as a way to have that kind of conversation with young people, it's because that's the language of young people. If suddenly that shifted, I have no great commitment to film, that I would say, well, where else do we need to go to be able to carry on a conversation with an audience you want to have a conversation with. I think, the reason that culture is important is because culture gives us a frame around which to understand the world. I don't think there's any such thing as just experience that's devoid of culture. And so that's why culture is part of any kind of social movement. And so when the stories around what it means to be an individual, what it means to be a man, revolve so much around violence and around control and around aggression and around intimidation, then it's not surprise. Won't be any surprise that that's how young people think about themselves, and that's how young people think about their identities. And in that sense, it's a form of control that narrows the range of appropriate ways that young people can think about themselves. And so my worry about violence isn't that violence, the representations of violence are going to make young people violent. Actually, we know that. We know that images don't work in that way. Individual images don't work to change behavior. But the images of violence tell a story about violence and how to be in the world. They tell a story about who can do what to whom and get away with it. Yeah. And so once we start thinking about violence as a story and how that then impacts upon my identity and how I am in the world, that becomes the frame. And the way I am in the world is to be, if you're a man, and masculinity is being defined in that way, the way to be a normal guy is to be intimidating. The way to be a normal guy is to be tough. The way to be a normal guy is to scare people. And I always say when there's a lot of talk about the school shooters and going through these schools, and it's not that they're abnormal. I actually think that when they had people cowering in front of them, or whether it's the shooter at Sandy Hook or the people at Columbine, I think they felt the most normal they've ever felt, because these are people who are on the outside. These were people who were bullied. These were people actually outside of that world, didn't inhabit normal masculinity. If you want to understand school shootings, we shouldn't understand them as abnormal. We should understand them as, this is what normal masculinity is. And this is someone enacting normal masculinity in a perverse way. But these were people, most of the school shooters were actually being bullied by this notion of masculinity. And this was a way for them to prove, no, look, we're real men. No one's going to laugh at me. No one's going to call me, a sissy anymore, because look what I've done. Sure. I mean, I don't think there's anything particular about a technology or a media form that limits what it's going to do. I mean, in that sense, I'm kind of old-fashioned in thinking about, technology as somewhat neutral, which is a very anti-Canadian position given the work of Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis, who really talked about the limits of what the technology can do. But when it comes to the internet, it is obviously an unbelievable potential resource. And I think it can be used in different ways. I think the way the left has used it so far, and progressives have used it, is in terms of kind of building a social movement among people that already exist. So it's not a really way of extending it, it's a way of organizing. And I think as an organizing tool, you can call a demonstration really quickly, or you can have an event really quickly. You can communicate to people who you know are going to be on this network really quickly. So I think in that sense, a lot of the things we've seen, up Tahrir Square, most probably would not have been as possible as quickly without access to social media as it was. I mean, it didn't create it because those social movements existed outside of that, but it was a form of organization. So I think in terms of organization, it's an absolutely indispensable tool, but it's a tool that we should use. In terms of, I think where I'm more skeptical about it is as a form of dissemination of information, and that somehow this is going to be an alternative to the monopolization of media in other forms. And I think that's simply not true. I don't think that, one thing we know about the internet is people normally go to places where they already have been before. So it's not a way of expanding, trying to get out to audiences who wouldn't otherwise be engaged with it. And in that sense, we've got to work with the same way. The issue with the internet is to democratize it as well, and is to make sure that we have access to the same audiences that mainstream advertisers do, and that we have the same place on, we have the same amount of bandwidth, and we have equal access to those things, which is why those media issues, media policies, I think are really important. But so I'm much more skeptical about its kind of potential to disseminate new information. I think as a form of organization, it is the best tool to use right now for social movements.